Montana Territory, 1883. The wind dragged dust across the dry road into Dry Creek Hollow, and folks turned cold eyes toward the woman limping beside the stagecoach, her skirt torn, her left boot split wide open. They called her useless. Willa Dean had heard it whispered behind hands in Kansas City, and now here, in a town she had never set foot in before. Her uncle's letter had promised a fresh start, a roof and work. But when she arrived, she found his sod house collapsed, his grave marked with a crooked stick, and nothing left but a rusted stove and a broken-handled shovel. She had no husband, no family, no money, and 2 children who were not hers, but who clung to her skirts like they were. Hazel and Hank, ages 6 and 4, had been left in her care after her older sister died from fever last winter. Their father had vanished weeks before. She had sold everything to feed them and buy the fare west. Now she had nothing left to give. She stood outside the general store, Hazel's small hand in hers, Hank asleep on her hip. Her arms ached. Her shoulders sagged. No one offered help, until the cowboy stepped out of the saddle shop across the street. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a sun-darkened face and a steady way of walking, like he had never once doubted where he was going. His coat was worn but clean, his boots dusted but sound. He paused when he saw her, and she braced herself. But he did not look away. He crossed the road, slow and calm, and stopped in front of her. "You lost?" he asked. Willa lifted her chin. "No." He looked at the children, then back at her. "You look like you could use a hand." She hated the heat rising in her face. "We are fine." "You sure?" Hazel's stomach growled. The cowboy crouched down, eye level with the girl. "You hungry, sweetheart?" Hazel looked up at Willa, uncertain. Willa hesitated. Then she nodded. He stood and jerked his chin toward the diner down the street. "Come on. I'll buy you supper." "I am not a charity case," she said, stiff. He looked her straight in the eye. "I did not say you were. I said you look like you need a meal. That is all." She stared at him a moment longer. Then she shifted Hank on her hip and followed. The diner was warm, the smell of beans and biscuits heavy in the air. The owner raised an eyebrow but said nothing as the cowboy guided them to a corner table. He ordered 4 plates, slid his hat off, and watched the kids eat like they had not seen food in days. "I am Quentin Price," he said quietly. "Willa Dean. You from Kansas?" She nodded. "My uncle had a claim here. Died before I got here." "Then what are you planning to do?" She looked down at her chipped plate. "I do not know." He leaned back in the chair. "I have a cabin about 5 miles out. I could use help keeping it clean. Cooking. I work cattle mostly alone. It is decent pay, and there is a spare room in the back. You and the kids could stay until you find something better." She stared at him. "Why would you do that?" He looked at her like it was simple. "Because you need help. And I do not see anyone else offering." Willa wanted to say no. She wanted to stay proud. But Hazel's cheeks were thin and Hank's ribs showed through his shirt. She swallowed hard. "Just for a little while." He nodded. "Just for a little while." Quentin's cabin sat against a ridge tucked behind cottonwoods with a wide porch and a stone chimney. It was not fancy, but it was sturdy, and it smelled like pine and saddle soap. Willa cleaned it top to bottom the first 2 days, scrubbing floors and shaking out rugs until her arms quivered. Quentin left her be, gone before sunrise and back after dark, leaving her flour, beans, and a few coins on the kitchen table. He said little, but when he did, it was kind. He brought Hazel a carved pony from town. He fixed Hank's shoe with an old boot heel and a nail. He built a second bed from leftover wood and moved it into the spare room. He never asked for more than she offered. Never looked at her with pity. One evening she found him on the porch rolling a cigarette but not lighting it. He watched the sky shift from gold to purple. "You do not talk much," she said. He glanced at her. Never saw much point in talking unless there was something worth saying. She folded her arms. "You think I am useless, too?" He turned his head. "No. I think you have been carrying more than most men I know, and you are still standing. That is not useless." Her throat tightened. Later that night, she lay awake in the back room, the kids breathing softly beside her. She stared at the ceiling and thought about the way Quentin had looked at her level, steady, like she was not broken. Like he saw something in her she had forgotten was there. Weeks passed. Snow came early. Willa learned to make stew from dried meat and wild onions. She chopped wood beside Quentin, laughing the first time she split a log clean. He showed her how to saddle a horse, how to check a fence line, how to shoot straight. They worked side by side in silence, but sometimes their eyes met, and something warm passed between them. He never touched her, never asked for anything. But one night, when Hank had a fever, Quentin sat up all night by the boy's side, wiping his brow with a damp cloth. And when Hank finally slept, Quentin looked at her and said, "I do not know how you did this alone." She whispered back, "I did not have a choice." He reached out, brushed her knuckles with his. "You do now." She did not pull away, and for the first time in years, Willa felt something inside her lift. Not because she was saved, but because someone finally saw her as worth saving. And she was not sure when it happened exactly, maybe when he built Hazel a dollhouse from scrapwood or when he taught Hank to whistle, but she started to love him. Not with fire, but with quiet, steady warmth. And every time he looked at her like that again, like she mattered, she felt stronger. Like maybe she was not useless after all. Like maybe she could build a life here. With him. By late November, the ground wore a crust of snow, thin as lace where the wind swept it off the prairie. The sun no longer warmed the porch, and Willa had begun rising earlier to get the fire going before the children stirred. Quentin left her a pair of wool gloves one morning, tucked beside the flour sack without a word. She found them before dawn, rough-stitched but warm, and slipped them on without comment. That afternoon, Hazel helped Willa shell beans at the kitchen table while Hank played with a pine squirrel tail he'd found near the woodpile. Willa's hands moved slow, her mind elsewhere. Quentin had spoken little the past few days, though his eyes lingered longer when they passed in the narrow hallway. She felt the shift between them, quiet but steady, like river ice thickening. "What's wrong with Mr. Price?" Hazel asked, her voice soft. "Nothing's wrong," Willa said. "He's just busy." Hazel frowned down at the beans. "He looks sad." That evening, after the children were asleep and the wind shook the shutters, Willa found Quentin in the lean-to behind the barn, repairing a harness strap by lantern light. She stood in the doorway for a moment, arms crossed against the cold. "You always work this late?" He didn't look up. "Only when something needs doing." She stepped closer, letting the warmth of the lantern reach her face. "Hazel thinks you're sad. She's a sharp one. She's not wrong, is she?" He ran his thumb along the edge of the leather, slow and careful. "I lost a brother to a stampede in Texas. Year before last. We ran a trail drive together. He was my only kin." Willa didn't speak. She waited. He was younger than me. Loud, full of hell. I pulled him off saloon floors more than once. But he never held a grudge. I figured we'd run cattle our whole lives. But that herd broke fast and he was under it before I could pull him clear. He looked up then, eyes unreadable. I came north after that. Figured quiet was better than ghosts. She stepped into the light, her boots crunching straw. "You don't have to carry it alone." He set the strap down and wiped his hands on a rag. "Neither do you." They stood there for a while, the lantern casting long shadows on the packed earth floor. Willa's heart beat slow and heavy. The silence didn't feel empty, it felt full, like something living in the space between them. "I want to pay you proper," she said finally. "Once I find work in town." "You're already working here." "I mean real work. With wages." He leaned against the workbench, arms folded. "You want to leave?" "I want to stand on my own feet." "You already are." She looked down at her hands. "Not yet." He studied her, quiet. "There's a teacher leaving in January. Schoolhouse is west of the river. You ever taught before?" She nodded. "Back in Kansas." "Before everything fell apart. Then I'll take you there when the roads open, if that's what you want." "It is," she said, though something inside her pulled back, uncertain. He nodded once. "Then it's settled." The next week, Quentin taught Hank how to tie a square knot. Hazel helped Willa boil down tallow for candles. Snow came heavier and the days grew shorter. Willa began reading to the children after supper, her voice low, while Quentin carved wooden buttons by the hearth. Sometimes he'd glance up and watch her mouth move over the words, and his gaze held something steady and unreadable. One night after the dishes were washed and the fire burned low, Willa paused beside Quentin's chair. "You ever think about starting over?" He looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" "Building something new, after all the loss. Not just surviving it but living again." He set the carving knife down. "Every day." Her breath caught. "Me too." And that was all they said. But something shifted after that. Small things. He started waiting for her to sit before he ate. She left his coffee on the porch rail before dawn, even when it froze in the cup. His hand brushed hers one morning at the basin, and neither of them moved away. Then, one evening, as the wind howled outside and the stove glowed red, Willa found herself lingering by the hearth after the children had gone to bed. She didn't speak. She just stood there, hands clasped before her, watching the firelight catch in his hair. "You don't have to wait up," he said, voice low. "I'm not tired." He looked at her then, full on, and she felt her breath grow shallow. "Willa," he said, and the sound of her name in his voice was different than before. A question, a vow, something between. She took a step closer. "I'm not leaving. Not yet." He rose slowly, like he didn't want to startle whatever sat between them. "You sure?" he asked. "I am." He reached out, only once, and cupped her face with calloused fingers, warm and careful. She closed her eyes. When their foreheads touched, she felt his breath, steady and close. And in that moment, with the snow falling silent outside and the fire low behind them, Willa Dean knew she had not only found safety. She had found home. The wind had settled by morning, but the cold clung to the floorboards like it meant to stay. Willa rose early, easing out from under the quilt while Hazel and Hank still breathed soft and steady beside her. She dressed by the dim firelight and stepped into the main room, finding Quentin bent over the stove, coaxing flame from yesterday's coals. "You didn't sleep," she said. He straightened, brushing a hand down his trousers. "Didn't want the pipes to freeze." She crossed to the basin and poured water from the kettle, steam curling up against her face. "You could have woken me. You needed rest. Your hands were shaking last night." She didn't answer, only dipped a cloth and wrung it out. When she turned, he was watching her not with concern, but with something quieter, more rooted. "I was thinking," he said, voice low, "we ought to get the root cellar braced better. That back wall's bowed near the corner." "I can help with that," she said, folding the cloth. "If you show me how." He nodded once. After breakfast, then. By midday, the sun had pushed past the low clouds, and the two of them worked side by side, driving cut lengths of pine into the frost-hard ground behind the cellar wall. Willa's shoulders burned, but she didn't stop. Quentin didn't ask her to. When the last post was sunk and the tools packed away, he handed her a strip of dried apple and leaned against the fence. "You ever miss city life?" he asked, eyes scanning the ridge. "Not once," she said, chewing slow. I never had it. Closest I came was Abilene. Didn't care for the noise." She glanced sideways at him. "You ever want more than this? More than the quiet?" He didn't answer right away. Then, "I used to think I'd settle near Austin, maybe buy a bit of land, raise something besides cattle. But after my brother died, I didn't want to see familiar things. I wanted distance." She nodded. "Distance can be a comfort, until it turns into loneliness." He looked at her then. "You lonely here?" "Not the way I was before." She wiped her hands on her apron. "But I still look at the road sometimes and wonder if I was meant to stop walking." "You stopped," he said. "That means something." She didn't reply, but her eyes stayed on his. That evening, Hazel asked if she could set the table, and Willa let her. Hank trailed behind Quentin, chattering about the tracks he'd found near the barn. Quentin crouched, listening, then pointed out the difference between rabbit and fox. After supper, Willa stepped outside to shake out the table linens. The stars had come out clear, and the moon cast long shadows across the snow. She stood a while, her breath rising like smoke. Quentin joined her without a word. He held a wool shawl and draped it over her shoulders. "I've been thinking," he said, "about spring." She turned toward him. "What about it?" "I've got a few head I might sell off. If I do, I could build onto the cabin. Make a second room behind the kitchen. Put in a window." She searched his face. "Why?" He shifted just a little. "So you'd have a space that's yours. Not borrowed." "I don't want borrowed space," she said, steady. "I want something that's mine by right. Not from pity." "Don't pity you, Willa. I know. That's why I'm still here." His eyes didn't leave hers. "Then stay. Not just through winter. Stay for good." Her breath caught. "You mean that?" "I've meant it since the day you patched my coat without asking." She laughed, soft and sudden. "That coat was an insult to thread." He stepped closer. "I can't offer fine things. No lace, no piano. But I can offer steadiness. And a home that won't ever be taken from you." She reached for his hand, rough and warm. "I don't want fine. I want real. I want you." The silence between them held, but it wasn't empty. Pulsed with certainty. Inside, the children's laughter rose faintly from the back room, and the fire snapped low in the hearth. Willa leaned into Quentin, her head resting against his chest. He held her there, solid as earth. And in that quiet, beneath Montana sky and moonlight, she knew the road had ended not in failure, not in surrender, but in arrival. She had been called useless, but here, in the arms of a man who saw her strength, she had built something lasting. A life, a love, a home. The river thawed by mid-March, cracking through its ice sheath in long, echoing groans that carried across the land. Meltwater ran in the gullies beside Quentin's pasture, soaking the earth until the wagon ruts disappeared. The horses stood ankle-deep in the muck near the east fence, and Willa, hip-deep in a row of early cabbage starts, had to tie her hem high to keep from dragging it in the mud. Quentin had taken to checking traps early, sometimes not returning until the sun hung high over the butte. Willa never asked where he went, but he began coming back with things she hadn't thought to want: a spool of strong thread, a tin of cloves, a puzzle carved from antler for Hank. He'd leave them on the table with the same quiet certainty he used when laying kindling, as if their presence needed no announcement. One afternoon, Willa found him behind the barn, skinning a hare with a practiced hand. She stood a few feet back, arms folded, watching the long, clean movements of his knife. "You always work this quiet?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Quieter the hand, cleaner the cut." She stepped closer. "You ever tired of doing things alone?" He paused, then wiped his hand on a rag. "I used to think I preferred it. Now I'm not so sure." She crouched beside him, careful with her skirts. "I've been thinking about the schoolhouse, the one west of the river." His jaw shifted slightly. "What about it?" "I don't think I'll take the position after all." He set the hair aside. "What changed your mind?" She picked at a bit of moss on the ground. "I thought I needed to prove I could stand on my own, that I had to earn my place, somehow. But I don't feel like I'm borrowing anything here. Not anymore." Quentin's eyes held hers. "You're not." They sat in the hush that followed, broken only by the wind slipping through the cottonwoods. Then she said, "Hazel's been asking about planting flowers. She pick a spot? She wants the slope near the stones. The rocky one. That ground's stubborn. So is she." He smiled, small and fleeting. "She gets that honest." Later that week, Quentin began tearing down the old chicken pen, boards long gone soft with rot. Willa helped him sort usable lumber from splinters, and by the third day they had enough to frame the beginnings of a new room behind the kitchen. Hazel watched from the porch, cradling a packet of seeds Quentin had brought from town. Hank followed them both with a stick he declared was a sword. One evening, when the smell of damp earth clung to her skin and her back ached from lifting boards, Willa stood by the kitchen door and watched Quentin sharpen his draw knife by lantern light. "I never asked what you want," she said quietly. He didn't stop his motion. "What do you mean? You've given so much space, time, your whole life's rhythm bent to fit us. But I don't know what you'd ask for if you were the one doing the taking. He set the blade down and turned toward her. You think I've been giving? Haven't you? He shook his head once. I've been receiving. Every day since you first stepped into this place. She stepped closer, her voice low. Then ask me. His breath left him slow. Stay. For good. Not because you need a roof. Not because I'm offering. But because you want this life. With me. She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through the worn calluses and heat. I do. That night, she kissed him under the rafters, the lantern casting soft gold on the low beams above. It was not rushed. It was not uncertain. It was the act of two people who had walked through fire and found each other whole on the other side. The next morning, Quentin hitched the wagon and took Hazel and Hank to the creek to gather smooth stones. Willa stayed behind, kneeling in the garden plot, pressing her fingers into the warming soil. Each handful felt like promise. When she looked up, she saw Quentin returning across the field, Hazel riding beside him on the bench, Hank asleep in the back with a handful of reeds in his grip. Quentin caught her eye from the driver's perch and tipped his worn hat, the sun catching in his hair as he did. And in that moment, with the smell of new earth and the sound of birds returning to the trees, Willa understood. She had not just found love. She had built it, plank by plank, word by word, in the quiet strength of shared labor and the slow unfolding of trust. They had called her useless. But here, in this life they had carved from frost and silence, she was everything. The first rain came in April, soft and steady, soaking into the earth and beating gently against the roof. Inside the cabin, Willa sat sewing new cuffs onto Quentin's work shirt, her needle pulling through the cloth with quiet steadiness. Hazel lay stretched on her stomach near the hearth, drawing shapes into a slate with the tip of a charred stick. Hank, half asleep, leaned against Willa's thigh, his thumb tucked into his palm now instead of his mouth. He was growing. Quentin came in from the barn, boots wet, hat dripping. He hung his coat by the door and knelt to pull off his boots, careful not to track mud across the floor. You're soaked, Willa said, not looking up from her stitching. Storm came in quick. I was up near the bluff when the horses started pacing. She tied off the thread and set the shirt aside. Any damage? Nothing serious. A few fence rails leaned too hard with the wind. I'll fix them tomorrow. Hazel looked up from her slate. Can I help? You can hand me nails, little one, but only if your mama says it's all right. Willa ran a hand through Hank's curls. After your lessons. Quentin moved to the table, poured himself a cup of coffee that had gone half cold. I was thinking, he said, once the ground firms up, we ought to ride into Three Forks. There's a blacksmith there who owes me a favor. He could make hinges for that door I've been meaning to put on the pantry. Willa glanced toward the pantry's open frame. You planning to keep me out of it? He cracked a tired grin. Planning to keep the mice out of it. She stood, shifting Hank into the crook of her arm. If we're riding to Three Forks, we need more than hinges. Hazel's outgrown her boots. I noticed. She's walking like one leg's longer than the other. Hazel raised her hands. That's because the left one has a hole. Willa tousled her hair. Then we'll patch it till we go. The rain turned heavier that night, drumming the roof in a steady rhythm. Willa lay awake beside Quentin in the bed they now shared, the children asleep in the room beyond. She listened to the storm, to the slow draw of Quentin's breath, and to the creak of the cabin settling into the season's change. He stirred. You thinking again? Always, she whispered. What about now? She traced the rise of his arm beneath the quilt. About your brother. About what he might have thought of me. Quentin was quiet a moment. He'd have liked you. He had a way of finding the people worth keeping, even when he didn't know what to do with them. She turned her head to look at him through the dark. You ever think of going back south? Not anymore. There's nothing there I want. Willa let that settle into her chest, warm and still. I've been thinking, she said, we ought to plant more than vegetables. Something for the bees? Maybe wildflowers. Bees thank you, he said. So will I. By early May, the addition behind the kitchen stood finished with a dry floor, a window facing east, and a shelf Quentin hung by hand. Willa let Hazel and Hank paint the shelf with leftover blue milk paint, and though their brushwork was uneven, she didn't smooth it. Quentin built a small coop near the tree line, and by the time the hens arrived in crates from a neighbor's farm, the children had named each one. One day, Willa came out to find Quentin sitting beside Hank with a hen tucked under his arm, showing him how to check for mites. Her heart, already full, brimmed over. One evening, after a supper of cornbread and beans, Quentin sat beside Willa on the porch while the children chased fireflies. The sun melted down behind the ridge, and the scent of wet sage clung to the air. "I've been thinking," Quentin said. "We ought to take that photograph." She looked over. "What photograph?" "The one that says we're a family. The one you hang above the hearth." Willa folded her hands in her lap. "You want that?" He nodded. "I want people to know what I've got. I want them to see it." A week later, they rode into town, dressed in their best. The photographer set them against a painted backdrop of distant mountains and handed Hank a wooden horse to hold still. Willa stood beside Quentin, Hazel's hand tucked into her own, and when the shutter snapped, she leaned into him just enough to feel the breadth of his shoulder against hers. They hung the picture above the hearth that evening. Hazel pointed it out every time someone came to visit, proud and certain. By midsummer, the flowers Hazel had sown along the rocky slope bloomed in orange and yellow waves. Willa tended them in the mornings, lifting Hank onto her hip when he wandered too far. Quentin's cattle grazed strong in the lower pasture, and the cabin stayed full with the scent of bread, damp earth, and something that could only be named as belonging. They married beside the cottonwoods, with the children tossing petals at their feet and the sky wide and cloudless above them. There was no preacher, just the land, the vow of hands clasped, and a promise spoken through eyes that had seen loss and chosen life again. That night, Quentin took Willa's hand as they crossed the threshold, the children already asleep in their beds. He didn't say much. He never had to. She knew what his silences meant now. Steadiness, devotion, the kind of love that didn't need to be named to be known. Years passed. Hazel grew into a tall girl with strong hands and a stubborn streak that rivaled Willa's. Hank followed Quentin into the pasture by the time he was 10, learning the rhythm of hooves and seasons. The cabin grew another room, another shelf, another memory built into the grain of the wood. Through it all, Willa and Quentin remained what they had always been: partners. Not just in labor, but in laughter, in morning coffee, in the way they moved around each other as if their bones remembered the shape of shared space. On quiet evenings, they sat by the fire, hands intertwined, the photograph above the hearth faded now, but still true. They had lost much, but they had built more. And in that life, carved with care, they were not only loved. They were home.